Hi there, welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. Today's episode is going to take a look at the astrology of the week starting April 6th. And even though there is a lot going on this week, I'm going to focus on the solar eclipse, which is definitely the biggest event happening this week. It's not the only event happening this week, but for our podcast here, that's what I'm going to talk about. So this solar eclipse in Aries, it is a very dramatic event, both astronomically and astrologically. So I want to talk a little bit about what to expect. I also want to talk a little bit about where eclipses fall in the kind of sphere of personal forecasting, which might shift your sense of how important this eclipse would be for you personally. I see so much discussion about, things like eclipses or maybe Mercury retrograde. And while they are important phenomenon, they're not always important for everyone. And they're not always important to everyone in the same way or at the same time. So that's just something I want us to all keep in mind. First things first, this eclipse is on Monday, April 8th. It is at 19 degrees Aries. If you're in Australia, the eclipse is actually going to be on the 9th, the day after. Because this eclipse is a new moon eclipse, we've got the moon blocking the light of the sun to Earth. So the moon is kind of between the Earth and the sun. And that means that the sun can dim in the middle of the day, which is really quite something. To, ancient peoples, this was considered a really worrisome omen. It was a cause for concern. The sun is considered to be the life-giving, kind of animating planet, and to have that lose its light was considered to be quite a cause for concern and worry. So historically, eclipses were things that were considered to be potentially troublesome from a meaning perspective. Astrologically, we're looking at that new moon in Aries, and it's just 4 degrees away from the node. And this new moon eclipse is near the north node, and they're only 4 degrees apart. And being so close is a clue to the intensity of the eclipse and also to the totality of the eclipse. Just before we get too far into all this eclipse info, I want to let you know about my next online astrology course, which is all about chart interpretation. If you've got the basics of planets and aspects sorted, it's time to add in moon phases and their role on personality, as well as fixed stars and the influence of sect on aspects. So if you're ready to deepen your understanding of a birth chart and you want to improve your chart interpretation skills, I hope you can join us. Class starts April 15, and you can find out more via my website, kellysastrology.com, and I will also share the link directly to the course below. So you can check that course out in the show notes below. Okay, so the eclipse is super close to the north node, and that's where we get the intensity. We will have a path of visibility. And of course, if you've had a look online at some of the eclipse maps, you can see that the northern part of Mexico, the southern part of the US, and even into places like Toronto, Montreal, or just south of Toronto, and then very close to Montreal as we get into Canada. So there is a band where the eclipse is visible. Eclipses are said to be more dramatic and to have a bigger influence on the affairs of the locations in which the eclipse is visible. So if you're thinking about what's going on in Mexico, think about the areas or the regions that have the eclipse visible through it. If you're thinking about what's going on in the US, think about the states that have the eclipse visible through it. And if you're thinking about what's going on in Canada, you could think about the areas, the provinces and the cities that have the eclipse are visible very close to it. Now, eclipses from an astrological perspective can be important even if you don't see them. And so we want to keep that in mind as well. This eclipse is a new moon. It's a solar eclipse and it's near the north node. So there's some of the technical terms to make sure you're getting down. And that combination, the solar or new moon eclipse near the north node, means that this eclipse has this driving hunger inside it. This might be like a hunger for more. It might be a drive to keep going. It might be a willingness to take on ever more complex challenges or projects. It's got an insatiable quality. Like when we have the North Node really emphasized like this, we don't want to stop. We can never get enough. We are never satisfied. There's always more that we are wanting or craving. So it's an insatiable energy. So this is an eclipse that can describe being willing to go to extremes to take things past established limits. So we're sort of ignoring the boundaries, the barriers, the rules, or the regulations. Well, there's the potential for that in this eclipse. And some of that might sound good, going past old limits, for instance. The only catch is that to do this, you're going to ignore a bunch of other things to pursue this obsession that you are just insatiable and can't figure out or can't get enough around. And depending on what you do get obsessed with, this could be really productive. And so we can see that fast tracking or that pattern breaking or that breakthrough energy, which is some of the potential positive side effects of the eclipse. And it might mean that in the short term, you just keep going. You're super productive or you're very single-minded. But it could mean that because of that, we are ignoring or excluding a bunch of other people or projects or priorities in our life. They may get neglected, and that may need to be made up for down the track. So that's important. I know you'll be thinking about that personally. It's also important, though, when we think about the fact that eclipses historically weren't so much used for personal forecasting and predictive work, but rather for leaders and kings and authority figures. And so if we think about the leaders being insatiable or having a driving hunger or going past established rules or boundaries, we can see some of the wildness and where some of that sense of things being out of control might be coming from. So, before we get too far into the nitty-gritty of the eclipse, I do want to make a couple of these points. So, historically, eclipses were used to primarily forecast for people in positions of power, leadership, and authority. We didn't typically see eclipses used to predict for each individual. And so that's an important point when we're looking at eclipses. We can certainly use them to guide us into certain themes and certain topics that are active at a certain point in time in each of our individual charts, but they are primarily, historically at least, have been used to forecast collectively. So about social leaders, political leaders, leaders in business and government, those types of things. So eclipses were really considered omens that showed what might befall a king or a queen or a leader. Or they might be describing what's happening in trade or war or agriculture, matters that might be affecting many, many people at once. And for this particular series of eclipses that we're currently in, the eclipses in Aries and Libra, with the nodes there at least, it's a lot about eclipses are sort of pointing to these major changes in relationship dynamics between countries, around trade, around war, around agriculture, etc. So when we say changing relationships at that kind of collective level, we're looking at changing alliances, changing trade agreements, changing the partnerships between different political groups, different financial groups, different social groups, for instance. So even though I know you'll be hearing a lot about this eclipse and you'll definitely be wondering what it might mean for you personally, it may not be the best tool to use for figuring out what's going on for you as an individual. There are lots of timing techniques that astrologers use. And in my work with clients, eclipses isn't one of my go-tos as a general rule of thumb. There are certain sort of instances where it's like, yes, this eclipse is going to be important for you and maybe for you, but for a bunch of clients, not so much. Usually the eclipse is most relevant for you if the degree of the eclipse is something in your chart. So if 19 Aries is your ascendant or your moon or your midheaven or your Venus or your sun, then that eclipse is more likely to be more relevant for you personally. Given that this is a solar eclipse in Aries and that Aries is a sign where the sun is exalted, said to be raised up, this is an eclipse that really speaks to this idea of a leader falling or losing power. Think about how the sun's light is blocked through a solar eclipse. Symbolically, the sun is the leader, the king, the figurehead, the person in charge. And if that person's planet gets blocked, like the planet representing leaders, the sun gets blocked, we're going to see that kind of block energy showing up around a leader or a person in a position of influence or power, as if they might be hemmed in or unable to operate as normal. So it might be more useful to think about how this eclipse might be changing the way leaders are operating, leaders that are hamstrung by circumstance or external events, or leaders that are being intentionally contained. And if we take that a little further, the general public, we might be thinking about the concept of leadership, the function of leadership, and what we want from a leader, and how we might want our leaders to operate in a different way to how they have in the past. So, all of those themes around changing dynamics to do with leadership, very specific to a solar eclipse in the sign of Aries. Now, if we do go ahead and bring this eclipse energy down to the personal level, another point that I want to make is that an eclipse is a bit like a punctuation point, a bit like an exclamation mark on a longer agitating influence that is tied to the transit of the nodes. So while this Aries eclipse is definitely a strong burst of intense energy around April 8th, it is also an exclamation point or an activation that ties into the longer pattern of the North Node moving through the sign of Aries. And that's been going on since July of 2023, and it will continue until January of 2025. We're almost around the midway point of that longer 18-month North Node in Aries transit. And so, if I'm thinking about the North Node and some of the qualities I was sharing earlier about intensity, about overdoing it, of never being satisfied, of kind of blowing past limits, there may be something that you've been kind of obsessed with and putting more energy or effort into since July of 2023. And it's maybe that since July of 2023, your focus on this thing has been increasing. And it will probably be a thing, a topic, or a person tied to the Aries house or the Aries part of your birth chart. And so what it might be is that thing that you started to really kind of got in you and you haven't been able to let go since mid 23, that's reaching a peak of energy, intensity, or even obsession under this eclipse. As if that mild obsession is kind of growing and taking over more of your thoughts and time. And that might be true for a good few weeks, either side of the date of the eclipse itself. So that more of your energy, more of your effort, more of your time is going in to this goal that you just are fixated on around the topics of the Aries part of your chart. So we could say a couple of weeks either side of the eclipse itself, so April 8th plus or minus 2 weeks, we might actually look at the entire time the sun is in Aries with the North Node, the co-presence of the sun in Aries, which is all of Aries season 2024. So that would have started back around the 19th of March when the sun came into Aries, and it'll continue until around the 19th of April when the sun goes into Taurus. So just to put the eclipse into its place in a longer cycle. And I mention that because I know it's really natural to hear that there's this big eclipse. It's very dramatic. It's very intense. It's happening on April 8th, to wonder what it might mean for you. And then to also think that all the things are going to happen on that very day of the eclipse, when in fact, it's more likely that this eclipse energy is a bit like a wave that has been building for a number of months and is coming to a peak, to a crest for sure, but then it will still have this kind of lag or lingering swell of energy for some time, even after April 8th. So just to kind of broaden our expectation or hold an appropriate amount of space for this eclipse, that it's not just on that one day. Now, having said all that, this eclipse definitely is a peak intensity or like a burst or an outpouring of energy. And that's got to do with the fact that this is the only eclipse we're going to have in Aries that will actually have the North Node or the node in Aries at the same time. We had an eclipse back in Aries earlier in 2023. But so the lunation was in Aries, but the nodes hadn't got to Aries Libra yet. They were still in Taurus and Scorpio. So that idea of concentration of energy around Aries, around the topics of Aries, which we're talking about in terms of leaders and battles and competition, which I'm going to say a little bit more about in a minute, and the topics of the Aries part of your chart, that concentration of energy, that's very real and very strong right now. So if we think about Aries, we've talked about like leaders and figureheads in regards to the solar eclipse being in Aries, but let's think about the sign, the territory of Aries. Aries is about the fight, the battle, and the competition. It's about the desire to prove yourself by taking on a challenge. And so there is definitely contention or disagreement that comes up in an Aries emphasis, whether it's a transit or an eclipse or anything else, not being afraid to like disagree or to say something or stand up for something, even if it creates some friction. Aries is totally okay with that. What we also see in Aries is this idea of individual preferences perhaps being at odds with each other. So my preferences versus your preferences, we're not in agreement because our preferences are different. Aries is a single-minded sign. It's a single-minded fire sign that helps you identify what might be best for you. It is about independence. It's about going solo, doing things in an individual way. And the challenge then becomes, how do you negotiate what might be best for you with what might be best for the people that you're in relationship or partnership with? And so we end up in this place of this going back and forward, negotiation of how do we manage these differing needs in our alliances, in our partnerships, in our collaborations. So that dance between trying to honor your needs while making space for the needs of a partner or even maybe a collaborator or maybe even an enemy could be a huge focus of what you're trying to negotiate right now. And if you want to tune in to where a lot of this might be showing up for you, how do I advocate for what I need? How do I speak up about what I want, even if that's going to change the way we've done things before? This could really be showing up about the topics of the Aries house in your personal chart. So if Aries is the 10th house or the midheaven, it may be that this eclipse is triggering these themes around work or in your career and professional life. It might be that Aries is 5th house for you, and these eclipse themes and this intense concentration of energy and activation might be showing up around children, around fertility, around creativity, or even around your connection to having fun. So there is a way to personalize this to the extent that you really want to tune into it. Now, if we look at the chart of the eclipse itself, it's important to note that the ruler of the eclipse, which will be Mars, because it's happening in a Mars-ruled sign, Aries, the eclipse ruler Mars is near Saturn and it's in the sign of Pisces. So this introduced a totally different quality of energy into the eclipse space. On the surface, this eclipse looks and feels like being ready and raring to go. With so much emphasis on Aries, there is this natural emphasis on newness and orientation towards beginnings and starting and initiation. But underneath that, we've got this Mars-Saturn-Pisces combination, which indicates some worry, maybe even some fear or concern, and perhaps some hesitation or some caution. Mars with Saturn indicates restraint, and it also shows that there is this sort of undertone of awareness that whatever is chosen, whatever we go towards or go away from now, is going to have some consequences in the future. and that practical limits like time, energy, and money, as well as actual rules and regulations, might influence what we are or aren't doing right now. So, the very vibrant Aries eclipse, which is very stimulating, very activating, huge burst of energy, it's a bit like there is an anchor behind it that might force a slowdown or indicate there are things that might indicate that the things you want to do need to be done in a certain way or on a certain schedule or with a certain amount of preparation or diligence. Mars and Saturn in Pisces sit in the 12th position to the eclipse. So if you've got something in Aries, anything in Pisces is picking up that sort of 12th placement and even that 12th house theme. So, what that can bring forward as well is this shadowy or hidden quality. And this might evoke ghosts from the past. It might bring forward a worry about something that's very old or that happened a really long time ago. So, as you find yourself moving through this eclipse energy, take some time to reflect on what battle you're ready to stop fighting. Maybe think about the new challenge, the new fight that you want to take on, and make sure you're as ready for that as you think you are. It might be worth exploring where healing or release are needed before you can take that exciting step forward that you want. There is this desire for bold and courageous choices through this eclipse, but we can't get there without dealing with unfinished matters from the past or dealing with our emotional, energetic, and psychological stuff. And that's partly what that Mars Saturn in Pisces in that 12th position is indicating. So during the time of the eclipses, and remembering that we get 2 eclipse seasons every year. So we're just coming to the tail end of the first eclipse season for 2024, and we will have another eclipse season late September, early October. When we're in eclipse season, we've got this shadowy energy, this idea of shadows emerging, old and new mingling and swirling around. So it might be helpful to be still and be quiet, to give yourself a chance to sort past from present and to feel in to the best way to unfold forward from here. In the eclipse episode from a couple of weeks ago, about the full moon lunar eclipse in Libra, I talked a lot about the idea of just getting comfortable with darkness and with stillness. And that would be really worthwhile revisiting now if you didn't catch that episode first go around. As a general guide, even though the eclipse itself is on Monday, the whole time that the moon will be in Aries can be unsettled, or that energy of sort of chaos or disconnect or those shadows coming through with patterns and routines all kind of up in the air. So that is a time, like the whole time the moon is in Aries, the moon is kind of in the eclipsing place, and you might feel out of sorts. You might find that your regular rituals and routines are temporarily disrupted. For the Eastern time zone, like Toronto and New York, this is going to be from about 8 a.m. on Sunday morning through to 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning. So even though the eclipse is on Monday, you might find, Sunday, Monday, early Tuesday, it's just got that wobble energy with the moon and the sun together with the node. Since an eclipse is a break in the usual pattern of things, I hope that any schedule switch ups that you're experiencing now ultimately help you consider what you may not have noticed about the way you normally do things. And I hope that this eclipse does help you reflect on and maybe re-choose about the battles or the challenges that are right for you at this point in time. Go gently, everyone, during this very unsettled period. Take care, and I will talk to you all again next week. Bye for now.